Four armed men walked into a Manhattan restaurant at 9:40 p., not to rob it, but to destroy one woman's life. Avery Sterling, CEO of a billion-dollar company, sat alone, believing the worst danger she faced was a hostile boardroom. She was wrong. Within 60 seconds, the doors were locked, the cameras were cut, and the men were moving toward her with the kind of quiet, professional efficiency that doesn't come from desperation, it comes from training. No one in that restaurant was going to help her, except one man nobody noticed. Tired father in a worn jacket, cutting his daughter's food, who hadn't been a weapon in 7 years. If stories like this are what you live for, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this one all the way to the end. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me the city and country you're watching. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. The restaurant was called Linden and Cross, and it was the kind of place where the lighting was always slightly too dim and the menu never listed prices. It sat on the east side of Midtown Manhattan, tucked between a private members club and a building that housed 3 different hedge funds. Clientele on any given evening was the kind that didn't look up when someone else walked in, because in a room full of people who mattered, everyone had already decided they mattered most. On a Tuesday night in late October, the dining room was maybe 2/3 full. A few two-tops near the window with couples who weren't talking much. A long table in the back where 7 men in suits were doing whatever passed for celebrating in finance. And over near the partition that separated the main floor from a smaller private section, a woman sitting alone, working. Avery Sterling was 30 years old, though most people who met her for the first time assumed she was older, because she carried herself the way people do when they've spent years being underestimated and finally stopped letting it show. She had dark hair pulled back from her face and wore a gray blazer over a white shirt, no jewelry except for a watch her father had given her before he died, and she was reviewing a document on her laptop with the focused expression of someone who had not fully decided what they were going to do about what they were reading. She had ordered the salmon and eaten maybe a third of it. The glass of white wine beside her laptop had barely been touched. What she was reading was a financial audit internal, unauthorized, pulled together over the past 6 weeks by a forensic accountant she had hired quietly, paying him out of her personal account. The numbers on the screen were not the kind of numbers that made a person feel better the longer they looked at them. They were the kind of numbers that explained a lot of things that hadn't made sense for a long time. Her CFO, a man named Douglas Hale, who had been with the company since before Avery took over, who had given a speech at the firm's 10th anniversary dinner about integrity and long-term vision and running a parallel network of shell accounts through 3 overseas subsidiaries. The money moved in patterns that were almost beautiful in their complexity, the kind of thing that took real intelligence to construct. Over 4 years, the number had grown to just under $2 billion. Avery had found the first thread 3 months ago, almost by accident, reviewing a quarterly report from the Singapore office that had a rounding error that didn't quite make sense. She had not told anyone. She had been careful, methodical, and she had been more scared than she had let herself admit, because she understood that the moment she exposed this, the people behind it would not simply accept the consequences. People didn't build a $2 billion fraud and then quietly go to prison. She had been careful. She had not been careful enough. Across the dining room, at a small table near the wall that gave a full sight line to the entrance, Caleb Mercer was having a conversation with his 8-year-old daughter about whether or not macaroni and cheese from a restaurant counted as the same thing as macaroni and cheese from a box. "It's completely different," Nora said. She was small for her age and had her mother's eyes and Caleb's stubborn certainty about almost everything. She was currently inspecting her fork as though it had personally offended her. "This has breadcrumbs on it. Breadcrumbs are fine." "I didn't ask for breadcrumbs. You asked for mac and cheese. This is mac and cheese." Nora set her fork down. "This is fancy mac and cheese. I wanted regular mac and cheese." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his fork, cut a small piece of his steak, and moved it to the edge of his plate. "Eat 3 bites, and I'll take you for ice cream." Nora picked her fork back up immediately. He watched her eat and felt the particular kind of tired that didn't come from a long day of work, though today had been long. 12-hour job patching HVAC systems in a building on 47th Street, but the kind that came from trying to be 2 people at once. He was the one who packed her lunch and attended parent-teacher conferences and knew the name of every kid in her class, and whether or not they were nice to her. He was also the one who woke up at 3 in the morning some nights, with his body already in a different posture, already calculating distance and angles and exit points, before his brain caught up and told him he was in his apartment in Queens and nobody was coming. He had been out of the Navy for 6 years, out of the teams for 5. He didn't talk about it. He didn't put it on his website or mention it when clients asked about his background. He drove a 9 pickup that needed a new transmission, and he wore the same 3 jackets in rotation. And when people looked at him, they saw exactly what he wanted them to see: a tired man in his late 30s who fixed things for a living and was more interested in making sure his kid ate dinner than in anything else happening in the room. That was the thing he had worked hardest at over 5 years. Not the work itself, which came naturally. Not even the nightmares, which had mostly faded. The hardest thing had been learning to look at a room the way a normal person looked at a room. He was not always successful. He noticed the 4 men at 9:42 p.m., 2 minutes after they entered. It wasn't one thing. It was the way information arrived in pieces that didn't add up to the obvious conclusion. First, the way the man who entered last paused just inside the door, not looking around the way people do when they're deciding where to sit, but assessing, filing. Second, the spacing between them as they moved into the room. Not together, not apart. Tactical. Third, the fact that none of them went to the host stand. Caleb set down his knife. The fourth thing was the one that mattered. One of the men moved toward the far wall with the unhurried purpose of someone completing a task they had already done twice in rehearsal. He reached the small junction box behind the decorative column near the restrooms, and he did something with his hand, and the small red light on the camera housing above the bar went dark. Caleb looked at Nora. She was still eating, carefully separating the breadcrumbs from the pasta, with the patience of a surgeon. He looked back at the room. 2 of the men were moving toward the private section where the woman with the laptop was sitting. Third had positioned himself near the main entrance. The fourth, the one who had killed the camera, was angling toward the side corridor that led to the kitchen and the service exit. They were sealing the room. Caleb looked at the woman they were moving toward. She hadn't looked up. She was still reading whatever was on her screen, her hand resting beside her wine glass, completely unaware that 2 men were 40 feet away and closing the distance with the calm that only comes from knowing exactly what you're about to do. Walk away. The thought was immediate and genuine, the same thought he had trained himself to have because it was the right thought for a man in his position, a man with a daughter who needed him to be alive and present and not the other thing. This is not your problem. You don't know what this is. Call 911 and get Nora out. He reached into his jacket pocket for his phone. The man nearest to him shifted direction. He was moving toward Nora's chair. It was subtle, probably not even intentional, just a repositioning as the man recalculated his path through the room. But he was moving toward Nora, and Caleb felt something in his chest go very quiet and very cold, the way a switch sounds when it clicks off. Not violently, just gone. He put his phone face down on the table. "Nora," he said, and his voice was even, quiet, the voice he used when he needed her to listen without asking questions. She looked up immediately, because she knew that voice even if she didn't know what it meant. "I need you to do something for me right now." "Can you do that?" "What?" "I need you to slide off your chair, go under the table, and stay there with your back against the wall. Don't look out. Don't make noise. Don't come out until I come and get you." "Okay?" Nora stared at him. "Dad, Nora." He held her gaze. "Right now, baby." She went. He heard the chair scrape softly, heard the small rustle of her moving beneath the tablecloth, felt the faint pressure against the table legs as she pulled her knees to her chest. Good girl. She was a good girl. Caleb stood up. He took 3 slow breaths and let his shoulders drop, let the tension out of his hands, let his weight settle through the floor the way his instructor had taught him a long time ago in a very different context. Not because it made him feel better, because it made him smaller looking and slower looking, and when people looked at him, they would see the tired contractor in the worn jacket just walking toward the bathroom. He moved across the dining room. The first words he heard clearly were from the taller of the 2 men who had reached Avery Sterling's table. He was leaning down with both hands on the surface, not touching her, keeping the posture just ambiguous enough that from a distance it might look like an intense conversation between colleagues. "We're not asking you to make a decision tonight," the man said. "We're telling you the decision has already been made. You're going to authorize the transfer, and you're going to do it in the next 15 minutes. or this conversation is going to get uncomfortable for everyone. Avery's voice, when she answered, was steadier than Caleb expected from someone in her position. I don't know who you think I am. Avery Christine Sterling, the second man said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her like they were old friends. CEO Sterling Meridian Group, worth, on paper, about $340 million. Father deceased. Mother lives in Connecticut. One younger sister teaches elementary school in Brooklyn. He smiled pleasantly. We know exactly who you are. Avery had gone still. The kind of still that isn't calm, it's calculation. What do you want, she said. A biometric authorization. Takes about 30 seconds. You've done it 1,000 times. The taller man reached into his jacket and produced a slim device, the kind of portable authorization reader that Sterling Meridian's finance team used for high-level transactions. Your thumb on the reader, a 6-digit confirmation code, and then you can finish your dinner. And if I don't, the pleasant smile stayed fixed on the second man's face. Then we're going to have to call Douglas. And Douglas has some ideas about how to make sure you're motivated. At the name Douglas, something shifted in Avery's expression. Not fear recognition, the particular recognition of someone whose worst suspicion has just been confirmed. This is Hale's operation, she said, not a question. Neither man answered, which was itself an answer. Caleb had stopped 4 feet away near a service station, his back to them, his hand resting on the edge of a linen cabinet. He was looking at the far wall, but he had counted the men's positions, measured the distances, noted what each of them was and wasn't carrying. The 2 at Avery's table were professionals. The one at the door had a secondary post near the host stand. The 4th was almost certainly standing in the service corridor, watching the kitchen exit. He did not have a weapon. He had not carried one in 5 years. He had his hands and his training and 40 feet of furniture, and the fact that none of these men were expecting him. He was about to do something that would change the life he had spent 5 years trying to build. He understood that clearly. He was not angry about it. He was not resigned. He simply understood it, the way you understand weather, not something you argue with, just something you step into. The taller man reached out and closed Avery's laptop. Make the call, he said. Or I have someone go pick up that sister from Brooklyn. Avery's jaw tightened. Okay, she said quietly. I'll do it. She was stalling. Caleb could hear it. She had answered too quickly, her voice too controlled, the way someone sounds when they've decided to buy time without yet knowing what they're buying it for. The man with the authorization device moved closer, and Caleb moved. He came from the side, not the front, the server's angle, the person delivering something angle, the angle that the human brain doesn't immediately register as threat because it's the angle that's always been benign. Caught the taller man's right arm at the elbow and the wrist in a single grip, used the man's own momentum from leaning forward to rotate him sideways and off balance, controlled the fall so it was quiet, and went between tables rather than through one. 3 seconds. The man hit the carpet with a sound like a chair falling over, loud enough to register, quiet enough not to trigger panic from across the room. The second man came up fast, good reaction time. Genuinely trained, he went straight for a grip rather than reaching for anything, which told Caleb he'd been in real situations before. They went backward together into the partition between the private section and the main floor, and the partition made a cracking sound that finally got heads turning across the restaurant. Avery was already on her feet. She'd grabbed her laptop and her bag by reflex. Caleb drove his elbow into the second man's solar plexus, felt him fold, caught his collar as he went down, and redirected him into the table, not enough to do serious damage, enough to put him on the floor for 40 seconds. He looked at Avery. Come with me, he said. Right now. She stared at him for a half second, reading him the way smart people read situations fast, without complete information, making the best bet available. Okay, she said. From across the room, someone shouted. The man by the door was moving. Caleb caught Avery's elbow and pulled her toward the service corridor, moving fast and low between tables, using the restaurant's layout, the way he'd been trained to use any terrain barriers first, bottlenecks second, exits third. Behind them, the dining room was beginning to understand that something had gone wrong. Ahead of them, the service corridor waited, and inside it, a 4th man was almost certainly standing in the dark. Caleb's daughter was still under a table in the corner, waiting for him to come back. He was going to come back. That was not a hope or a plan. That was the only fact in the room that mattered. The service corridor was narrow and poorly lit, the kind of functional space that upscale restaurants spend no money on because guests never see it: bare concrete walls painted in institutional beige, pipes running along the ceiling, the smell of industrial cleaning fluid and old grease from the kitchen 30 feet ahead. A single fluorescent tube buzzed and flickered above a stack of linen carts. The floor was rubberized black mat, the kind that absorbed sound, which was exactly why Caleb heard the man before he saw him. Not footsteps, the man was too good for that. It was breathing. Shallow, controlled, the breathing of someone who had been standing still in a confined space for a while and had regulated themselves down to near silence. Caleb had done it himself in places with worse lighting and higher stakes, and he recognized it the way you recognize an accent from your hometown. He stopped moving and put his arm out to stop Avery. She almost walked into it. He felt her stiffen. He turned his head just far enough to put his mouth near her ear. "Don't make a sound. Stay exactly where you are." He felt her nod a single tight movement. The corridor had one overhead light and two stretches of shadow, one near the linen carts at the midpoint, one near the bend where the hallway turned toward the loading dock exit. The breathing was coming from the second shadow. The man had chosen the bend because it gave him a sightline to the corridor entrance and the kitchen door simultaneously. Smart positioning. But the linen carts broke the sightline from the bend, back toward the restaurant entrance, which meant he hadn't seen them come in. Caleb thought about it for less than 2 seconds. He picked up a metal serving tray that was leaning against the wall near a utility shelf, angled it slightly, and slid it along the floor toward the kitchen door with a single quiet push. It moved 6 feet and then scraped the bottom of the door with a short metallic sound, not loud, but in a silent corridor loud enough. The shadow at the bend shifted. Caleb was already moving. He covered the distance in 4 steps, came around the linen cart at an angle the man wasn't expecting, and they collided hard against the wall, Caleb's forearm across the man's throat, his knee driving up to take the fight out of him before it could start. The man was bigger than the two at Avery's table, broader through the shoulders, and he didn't go down easy. He got one hand free and drove it into Caleb's ribs, which connected solidly and sent a jolt of pain up through Caleb's side that he acknowledged and filed away for later. He torqued his grip, changed the angle, felt the man's balance shift, and used it. The man went down. His head met the wall on the way, and he stayed down. Caleb stood over him for a moment, breathing through his mouth, his ribs complaining. He reached down and checked the man's jacket, a compact radio in the inside pocket, an earpiece coiled around it. He pocketed the radio. He walked back to where Avery was standing. She was pressed against the wall with her laptop bag clutched to her chest, and she was looking at him with the specific expression of someone whose working model of the world has just been significantly revised. Not panic, she hadn't panicked, which he noted, but something between shock and intense recalibration. "He's alive," Caleb said, because it seemed like the thing to say. "Who are you?" she asked. Someone who was trying to have a quiet dinner. He moved past her toward the corridor entrance. "We need to move. There's still 2 of them in the restaurant and 1 on the door, and the guy I just put down has a radio, which means somebody's going to notice when he stops checking in." Avery moved. He gave her credit for that. She didn't stand there asking more questions. She just moved. Back in the restaurant, the situation had deteriorated in the way situations do when professionals run out of patience. The 2 men Caleb had put on the floor near Avery's table were back on their feet, slower, angrier, and no longer interested in keeping things quiet. The taller one, whose name Caleb would later learn was Garrett, had produced a weapon from a shoulder holster and was holding it low against his thigh, not pointed at anything specific, just present. It was a message to the other 8 or 9 diners still in the room. Stay in your seats. Keep your phones in your pockets. And be very still. Most of them were complying. 2 women near the window were holding each other's hands. The group of men in suits at the back table had gone absolutely motionless in that particular way of people who have decided that their net worth and their survival instincts are not compatible. One older man near the front was breathing too hard and too fast, and his dinner companion, a woman who was probably his wife, had her hand on his arm and was speaking to him very quietly. The man by the door had not moved. He stood with his back to the glass, arms at his sides, watching the room. His name was Price, and of the 4, he was the one who had been doing this kind of work the longest. He had seen people panic, and he had seen people do something stupid, and he had seen a room full of wealthy New Yorkers collectively decide that their lives were worth more than their pride, which was the usual outcome. What he had not seen tonight was the man in the worn jacket "Come back out of the service corridor." That bothered him. He reached up and pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece. No response from the corridor. He pressed again. "Vasquez." Nothing. He looked at Garrett across the room. Garrett looked back. Something moved between them, the silent communication of people who have worked together long enough to share a bad feeling without words. Garrett said something to the man beside him, the second one, whose name was Roth, and Roth moved toward the service corridor entrance. Caleb came back into the dining room through the kitchen. He had told Avery to wait just inside the kitchen door, behind the pass-through, with a clear line to the emergency exit on the east wall. The kitchen staff had retreated to the far end of the space when everything started. A cook and 2 dishwashers who were currently standing near the walk-in refrigerator, looking at Caleb with the cautious attention of people who have decided not to make decisions until someone tells them what's happening. He had held up one hand as he passed through, and they had stayed where they were. He came through the swinging kitchen door at an angle that let him see the room before anyone in the room saw him. Garrett was 15 feet away with a weapon, watching from the far side of the room. Roth was disappearing into the service corridor. He was going to find Vasquez in about 40 seconds. Price was at the door. 3 men, 2 of whom were armed. 1 room, 8 or 9 civilians. Caleb thought about his daughter under the table in the corner. Couldn't see that corner from where he was standing. He thought about the tablecloth. The specific tablecloth white linen fell almost to the floor. Gave her enough cover that she'd be invisible if she stayed still. She was good at staying still when it mattered. She had learned that from him, though not in any way he had ever intended. He had maybe 30 seconds before Roth found Vasquez and the dynamic shifted. He did not have a clean solution. He had the kitchen, which put him behind Garrett, and the element of surprise, which was diminishing by the second, and the weight of the serving tray he had picked up from the pass-through, which was stainless steel and heavier than the one in the corridor. He's also had the fact that Garrett, despite being armed and trained, had his attention split across 8 points of potential movement in the room, which meant his reaction time was fractionally degraded. Fractional was enough. Caleb came through the kitchen door with the tray angled low, not as a weapon, as a screen, blocking Garrett's view of him for the 2 steps it took to close the distance. He drove his shoulder into Garrett's gun arm at the precise moment he felt the man begin to react, driving the weapon toward the floor rather than toward anything living. There was a short, violent struggle that moved one table and knocked an entire place, setting onto the carpet. A woman screamed. Caleb got both hands on Garrett's wrist and bent it at an angle that produced a specific sound and a specific result. And the weapon went down, and Garrett went down with it, and Caleb stepped back, kicked the weapon under the nearest table. Garrett was on his knees, holding his wrist, looking up at Caleb with an expression that had passed through pain and arrived somewhere darker. "Who are you?" he said through his teeth. Caleb didn't answer. From across the room, Price was moving away from the door. The next 4 minutes were not clean. They were not the kind of thing that played out in a straight line with clear cause and effect. They were the kind of 4 minutes that get compressed in memory later, jagged, overlapping, the kind where the body takes over, because the brain is processing too slowly to be useful. Price was good. Better than Garrett, better than Roth or Vasquez, and he didn't make the mistake of coming straight at Caleb, which would have been the faster route. He moved to Caleb's left, using the long table as a barrier, putting himself in a position where Caleb would have to either go over furniture or around it, and either option gave Price a half-second of advantage. He also moved 2 civilians out of the way physically, by the shoulders, not gently, which told Caleb something about how Price thought about this situation. He wasn't using them as shields. He was clearing them. Whatever he intended to do to Caleb, he didn't want witnesses close enough to matter. Professional, experienced, and somewhere underneath the professionalism, genuinely angry, which meant he was running partly on instinct, and instinct sometimes created gaps. Caleb went over the table. It wasn't graceful. His knee caught the edge. A glass went over. He landed badly on the other side, and his ankle rolled on the wet carpet, and he had to catch himself on the next table over. But it was faster than going around, and it closed the distance before Price had finished recalculating. They hit each other in the middle of the room in front of everyone. Price was heavier than he looked. He had a low center of gravity, and he knew how to use it. Dropping his weight the moment, Caleb tried to take him off balance. They went back and forth between tables for what felt like longer than it was. Caleb absorbing 2 hits to the body that would need attention later, Price absorbing 1 to the jaw that snapped his head sideways and made him miss a step. The older man near the front was being pulled toward the exit by his wife, finally, which meant at least one of the civilians was getting clear. From the service corridor, Caleb heard footsteps. Roth coming back. He didn't have time to finish this cleanly. He fainted, left, felt Price commit to the counter, and went right instead, catching the man's arm, using the momentum of Price's own movement, spinning him into the table behind him. Price went over it backward, taking the table with him in a crash of silverware and broken glass. He hit the floor hard. He tried to get up and managed to get to one knee before his body registered that it wasn't ready yet. Caleb turned. Roth was in the doorway of the service corridor, looking at Garrett on the floor and Price trying to get upright, and Vasquez presumably still unconscious in the corridor behind him, and the particular look on his face was one Caleb recognized the look of a man doing rapid arithmetic on very bad numbers. "Your guy in the corridor is going to be fine," Caleb said. His voice was level, but his breathing wasn't, and his ribs were producing a low, steady pain that suggested one of Price's hits had connected better than he'd wanted to admit. "Everybody in this room is going to be fine. You need to make a decision right now about whether you want to be part of that." Roth looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket slowly, 2 fingers, and produced his phone and set it on the nearest table. "I'm done," he said. "Hands behind your head." Roth put his hands behind his head. The emergency system came back online 6 minutes after the camera feed had been cut a failsafe built into the restaurant's security protocol that nobody in the room had thought to account for, including the 4 men who had planned this. It reactivated the cameras, sent an automatic alert to the building's security company, and unlocked the front entrance. The first person through the front door was a security guard from the building next door, who had been alerted by the monitoring company, and had not yet understood what he was walking into. Stopped inside the entrance and looked at the room, the overturned tables, the broken glass, the man sitting on the floor with his wrist at a wrong angle, the other man kneeling with his hands behind his head, the woman standing near the kitchen door holding a laptop bag, and the man in the worn jacket standing in the middle of all of it, with a split lip and a careful expression. "Sir," the security guard started. "3 men need medical attention," Caleb said. "1 is in the service corridor. You need to call the police and make sure nobody leaves this building." He paused. "And you might want to call a lot of police." The guard got on his radio. Caleb walked to the corner table. He crouched down and lifted the tablecloth. Nora was exactly where he had told her to be, back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, one hand pressed over her mouth the way she did when she was trying very hard not to make a sound. She had her eyes open. They were wet. When she saw his face, something in her expression broke open in the way children's faces do when they have been holding everything together by a sheer willpower, and then the person they needed walks through the door. "Dad," she said, and it came out shaky. "Hey." His voice dropped. Became something completely different, not the flat, controlled instrument he'd been using for the past several minutes, but softer, rougher around the edges, the voice that existed only for her. "Hey, it's okay, you did so good." She came out from under the table and into his arms, and he held her against his chest with his chin on top of her head and closed his eyes for a moment. His ribs screamed at him. He didn't move. She was shaking, just slightly, not crying. Not quite. Just the aftermath of being 8 years old and very scared and very brave.
"You okay?"
he said into her hair. She nodded against his chest. "I didn't look," she said. "You told me not to look." "I know. I know you didn't. I heard stuff, though." "I know." She was quiet for a second. He felt her breathing slow down against him. Then she pulled back just far enough to look at his face, the split lip, the beginning of something that was going to be a bruise along his cheekbone. "You got hurt," she said. "A little bit." "Does it hurt?" He thought about lying. He always thought about lying for a half second because she was 8 and he didn't want her to worry. And then he always told her the truth because she was the most perceptive person he knew, and she always found out anyway. "Yeah," he said. "A little. I'm okay." She studied him for another moment in that serious way she had, the way that made her look 40 years old behind the eyes, and then she leaned her head back against his chest. "Okay," she said. Avery had not moved from near the kitchen door. She had watched the whole thing, Caleb going back into the room, the fight with Price, Roth standing down, the security guard, All of it with the attention of someone who understood that she was watching something that had been performed, specifically so that she could still be standing here to watch it. She had been in dangerous situations before. Not physical ones, the dangers in her life had been boardrooms and legal threats and emails that arrived at 2A. M from lawyers who wanted her to be afraid. She had been afraid, plenty of times, and she had mostly been afraid alone. Because the corner office she had spent a decade working toward had a door that she kept closed and a reputation for self-sufficiency that had long since calcified into actual isolation. She had never seen someone make a room full of armed men manageable through sheer applied intelligence. That was what it had been. She understood that now that her heart rate was dropping. Not brute force, though there had been that. It had been reading and positioning and timing, and a specific kind of calm that wasn't the absence of fear but something built on top of it. She watched him hold his daughter in the corner. Something shifted in her chest that she didn't have an immediate category for. She walked over. She stood a few feet away and waited until he looked up, not wanting to intrude on something she had no business intruding on. When his eyes found her, she said the only thing that seemed honest. "I don't know your name." He looked at her for a second. "Caleb Avery," she paused. "I know that probably seems unnecessary at this point." "No," he said. "It doesn't." Nora turned her head and looked at Avery from the shelter of her father's arm. Her face was red around the eyes, but she had stopped shaking. She studied Avery with the frank assessment that children perform without embarrassment. "You're the lady they were surrounding," Nora said. "Yeah," Avery said. "I am. My dad went and helped you." "He did." Nora looked at her father, then back at Avery. "He wasn't supposed to," she said. "He hates getting into other people's stuff." Caleb said quietly, "Nora, what? You do?" Avery found to her own surprise that she almost smiled. "That's fair." Outside, through the unlocked front entrance, she could hear sirens still a few blocks away, but getting closer. The particular layered wail of multiple units responding to something they had been told was serious. The restaurant around them was a disaster of overturned furniture and broken glass, and the specific kind of suspended stillness that settles over a space after violence has passed through it. Two of the men were sitting on the floor against the wall, Roth still with his hands behind his head, Garrett cradling his wrist. Through the corridor entrance, she could hear Vasquez beginning to make sounds that suggested he was regaining consciousness. Price was still on the floor near the overturned table, sitting up now, his back against the wall and his expression closed. He was looking at Caleb with the focused attention of a man cataloging information. He had not looked at Avery once. That told her something. Whatever this had been, whatever Douglas Hale had set in motion, the moment she started pulling on that thread in the quarterly report, it wasn't finished. The men in this room were a mechanism, not a decision. The decision had been made somewhere else, by someone who had looked at the numbers she'd found and decided that the easiest solution was to make sure she couldn't use them. She thought about her CFO, about the speech he had given at the 10th anniversary dinner, about the way he had looked at her across the conference table 1,000 times with that particular expression of measured approval, like she was a bright student who had mostly gotten the right answers. She had trusted him. Not completely, not the way she trusted her father or her sister, but professionally, which was its own kind of trust and its own kind of betrayal when it broke. She had been careful for 3 months. She had not been careful enough. But she had survived tonight, and she had the documents, and she had the audit, and she had something she hadn't had 3 months ago. When she'd first found the rounding error in the Singapore report, she knew exactly who was behind it. The sirens were close now. She looked at Caleb, who was still crouching beside Nora, one hand on her daughter's back, watching the room. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "When the police get here, they're going to want to know everything, and everything is going to be complicated." She hesitated. "I want you to know that I'm going to tell them exactly what happened. All of it, including what you did." He held her gaze.
"Okay."
"I'm also going to tell them what Douglas Hale is behind, which means tonight is probably going to be the beginning of something longer and messier than just this." Now she glanced at Nora, then back at him. "I don't know what your situation is, but if what's coming affects you in any way professionally, legally, any way, I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to make sure it doesn't." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He wasn't a man who seemed to feel the need to fill silence, which was something she noticed. "I'm not worried about that," he said. "Why not?" He looked at Nora, who had settled against his side and was now watching the room with her father's eyes cataloging. Measuring, deciding what mattered. Because I didn't do anything wrong, he said simply. Avery nodded slowly. No, she said, you didn't. The first police unit came through the front entrance, 2 officers in uniform, hands on their belts, scanning the room with the trained wariness of people who had been told to expect something bad and were not sure what form it had taken. They stopped. They looked at the room. One of them said something into his radio. Caleb stood up. He kept one hand on Nora's shoulder. Officers, he said, in the same level voice he had used all night. I can explain what happened. And outside on the street, the night was filling up with lights blue and red against the Manhattan glass, the ordinary machinery of consequence finally arriving to sort through what 4 professional men and 1 tired father in a worn jacket had made of a Tuesday evening. Avery looked at the radio in Caleb's jacket pocket. She looked at the men on the floor. She looked at the broken glass and the overturned furniture and the linen that had been pulled off 3 different tables in the chaos. She thought, Douglas Hale is somewhere in this city right now. He's probably already heard from someone that it went wrong. He's probably already making calls. She tightened her grip on her laptop bag. She had the documents. She had survived. And now she had a name, a mechanism, and a room full of evidence that somebody was going to have to answer for. Whatever came next was going to be loud and complicated and fought on ground she knew better than any room full of hired men. A boardroom. A courtroom. A story told to the public before the people behind this had time to rewrite it. She had been building this company since she was 23 years old. She had survived things that people told her she wouldn't survive. She had done it mostly alone, and she had believed that aloneness was a form of strength. Tonight had not confirmed that belief. Tonight had very quietly begun to dismantle it. She stood in the wreckage of the restaurant and watched the police take statements, and she held on to that thought, the unexpected, uncomfortable, necessary thought that the reason she was still standing here, holding her laptop bag, was because a man she had never met had looked across a dining room and chosen not to stay in his seat. That was worth something. She didn't have a word for what it was worth yet, but she was going to spend some time figuring that out. The police station on West 54th Street had the specific energy of a place that had seen everything and was mildly annoyed to be seeing more of it at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The fluorescent lights in the interview room were the kind that made everyone look slightly unwell, and the table had a scratch across it in the shape of a question mark that Caleb kept looking at while he waited for the detective to come back with coffee that he had said yes to mostly, so the man would leave the room for a few minutes. Nora was asleep in a chair outside. He had checked twice through the window in the door. A female officer named Caruso had given her a department sweatshirt that swallowed her completely and a vending machine hot chocolate that Nora had accepted with the gravity of someone receiving a significant gift. She had been asleep within 10 minutes, which was what 8-year-olds did, apparently survived genuine terror, and then crashed as completely as if it had been any other Tuesday. He wished he could do the same. His ribs were taped. A paramedic at the scene had wrapped them before he gave his statement, 2 possibly cracked, the rest badly bruised, the kind of injury that would wake him up every time he rolled over for the next 3 weeks and otherwise be fine. His lip had stopped bleeding. His ankle was sore but not serious. The checklist of damage was familiar in a way he didn't entirely welcome, the way you recognize the smell of a place you thought you'd left behind. The detective's name was Okafor, a heavy-set man in his 50s, who had the energy of someone who had given up being surprised by people a long time ago and was now simply interested. He had listened to Caleb's account of the evening with the particular stillness of a good listener, asking clarifying questions at careful intervals, never leading. Caleb had given him everything not out of legal obligation, though there was that, but because the situation called for clarity and clarity required completeness. He had been careful about what he included, what he had seen, what he had done, the exact sequence of events, not what he had felt, not the specific mathematics of the decisions he had made. Some things didn't translate. Okafor had not asked about his background. Caleb had not volunteered it. That conversation was probably coming, and he was prepared for it, but he was glad for the delay. What he was thinking about, sitting alone in the interview room with the question mark scratch and the bad lights, was not the fight. It was the moment before it, the moment when he had looked across the dining room and done the arithmetic, fast, the way he had been trained to do it, and arrived at the answer he had spent 5 years trying not to arrive at. There had been no hesitation. That was the part he kept returning to. He had told himself, over 5 years that the man he had been in the teams was something he had deliberately set down. Tool you used when the situation required it, and returned to its case when the situation was over. And eventually, the case stayed closed long enough that you started to believe the tool was something separate from you. That was the version of himself he had constructed for Nora's sake, and his own the contractor, the father, the man who fixed things with his hands and kept his head down, and found in the ordinary rhythm of an ordinary life something that felt, most days, like enough. Tonight had dismantled that version in about 45 seconds. The worst part was that it hadn't felt like a failure. It had felt like breathing. He was still sitting with that when Okafor came back with 2 cups of coffee from a machine in the hallway and set one in front of Caleb without ceremony. "Your daughter's still out," Okafor said, settling into the chair across from him. "Officer Caruso's keeping an eye." "I know, thank you." Okafor wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at Caleb with an expression that was professionally neutral but not unfriendly. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that this is not an accusatory question. It's a practical one." Caleb waited. "The 4 men you described, Garrett, Roth, Vasquez, and Price. These are not amateurs. Garrett has a federal record for private security contracting in 3 different countries. Price is former, we think, military, possibly special operations based on the way he carries himself, but his background is a wall." Okafor set his cup down. "The medical team who treated them at the scene said the injuries were consistent with someone's who had significant hand-to-hand training. Not gym training, field training." He looked at Caleb without looking away. "So, practical question, who are you?" Caleb turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Navy," he said. "I got out 6 years ago." "Which component?" Pause. "SEAL teams." Okafor nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already mostly decided. "And now you fix HVAC systems." "And now I fix HVAC systems." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "Then, I've known 3 former SEALs in my career. One of them sells insurance in New Jersey. One runs a security company in Dubai. One is currently doing 12 years in a federal prison for something I won't get into." He picked up his cup. "You're not going to be charged with anything. I want to be clear about that. What you did tonight was reasonable defense of yourself and others, and the DA is going to look at those 4 men and that restaurant and that woman's testimony, and they're going to agree with me." He paused. "But I need you to understand that this is not finished. What happened tonight is connected to something significantly larger, and you are now a witness in what is looking like a federal matter." I figured. "Miss Sterling has been very forthcoming about the financial documents she was carrying. The FBI has been called. They're going to want to talk to you." Okafor looked at him steadily. "They're also going to dig into your background. That's not a threat, it's just what they do. Is there anything in your service record I should know about that's going to complicate this?" Caleb thought about that honestly. "No, my record is clean. Some of it's classified, but that's not the same thing." "Understood." Okafor stood. "We're going to need you to stay available over the next few days. Don't leave the city. Your daughter, is there someone who can take care of her while this gets sorted?" Caleb thought about his sister in Jersey City, who would drive through anything to come get Nora, and who would also spend 40 minutes on the phone asking him why he hadn't called sooner. "Yes, good." Okafor moved toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing. The leader Price. He asked about you. Specifically." He said it carefully, watching Caleb's face. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Find out who that man is and find out who sent him." Caleb looked up. "He thinks I was hired," Caleb said. "Not a question. It appears so." Okafor's expression held something that might have been grim amusement. "He finds it difficult to believe that someone with your particular skill set was in that restaurant by coincidence, eating dinner with his 8-year-old daughter." He opened the door. "Frankly, if I didn't have a daughter who insists on fancy mac and cheese, I might find it hard to believe myself." He left. Caleb sat alone for another moment with the bad coffee, and the question mark scratch and the sound of the building around him, which was the sound of consequence voices in adjacent rooms. Keyboards, the radio traffic of a department sorting through an evening that had started as a simple assault report and was rapidly becoming something that required federal jurisdiction. He thought about Price. The man hadn't said a word during the arrest processing, hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't made statements, hadn't done anything except sit with his back straight and his face blank in the way of someone running out the clock. But he had asked about Caleb. which meant Price understood that the most important variable in tonight's equation was not Avery Sterling or the documents or the botched authorization. It was the man in the worn jacket who had dismantled 4 professionals in a Manhattan restaurant and walked out the other side without a weapon and without a plan beyond protecting one woman and getting back to his daughter. Price had worked with enough professionals to know what professional looked like, and he wanted to know where it had come from. Avery's interview was in a room 2 doors down, and it had been going on for longer. She had 3 lawyers present her general counsel, a criminal defense attorney who had arrived in a car that had clearly come from somewhere nicer than a Tuesday evening office, and a woman from the company's crisis management firm who sat in the corner taking notes and saying almost nothing. The FBI agent who had joined the interview 40 minutes in was named Reyes, late 30s, with the posture of someone who ran regularly, and the expression of someone who had been following Sterling Meridian's financial anomalies for a longer time than tonight might suggest. The Singapore subsidiary irregularity, Reyes said, looking at a document she had printed from the audit Avery had provided. You said you first identified this 3 months ago. A rounding error, Avery said. Her voice was steady, though she had been in this room for 2 hours, and she had not eaten since the salmon she had barely touched. The kind of thing that shouldn't have been there. Quarterly report was off by a number that didn't correspond to any transaction I could find in our standard ledger. You hired a private forensic accountant. I paid him out of my personal account. I didn't go through company finance, obviously. Reyes looked up. Because you suspected someone in finance. Because I suspected Douglas Hale. She said his name without flinching. She had been saying it for the past 2 hours, and each time it came out cleaner, less complicated by the history attached to it. He's been CFO since before I took over the company. He was brought in by the board before my tenure. I inherited him, essentially. She paused. I want to be accurate about something. I didn't suspect him based on intuition. I suspected him based on the structure of the accounts. The shell companies in the Singapore network are organized in a way that requires CFO-level access to the master ledger. There are maybe 4 people in the company who could have built that architecture. Douglas was the one with both the access and the tenure. How long do you believe this has been ongoing? Avery had been dreading this question because the answer was one she had spent 3 months trying to prove, and part of her still didn't want to believe. My forensic accountant's working estimate is 4 years, possibly longer, but the documentation before 4 years is harder to reconstruct because of a server migration we did in. In 2021, Reyes said, glancing at something. We're aware of the migration. Avery looked at her. You've been looking at the company. Reyes was careful. We've been looking at a number of entities in the financial sector that share certain structural characteristics. Sterling Meridian appeared in our analysis approximately 7 months ago. 7 months. Avery absorbed that. So you've been looking at my company for 7 months, and nobody told me. We couldn't tell you, Miss Sterling, because at that stage we didn't know where the irregularities originated. One possibility we had to consider was that you were aware of the scheme. The silence in the room was the particular silence of something being said out loud that everyone had been thinking. Avery's criminal defense attorney shifted in his seat. The general counsel put down his pen. Avery looked at Reyes without looking away. And now? Now, Reyes said, you're sitting in a police precinct at midnight with medical tape on your wrist from where someone grabbed you, and you've handed us 4 years of forensic documentation that your own CFO sent 4 men to prevent you from releasing. She closed the folder. I think we can revise our working assumptions. It was past 1 in the morning when they put Avery in a department vehicle, unmarked, because Reyes had made the point clearly that until they knew the full scope of Hale's network, they did not know how many people were aware of Avery's movements, and a car service was not a controlled environment. She was going to a hotel under a name that wasn't hers, with a detail outside the door, and she would be there until the FBI could assess whether the 4 men in custody had communicated with anyone else before their arrest. She didn't argue. She had spent enough of tonight being smarter than the situation required, and the fatigue of it was catching up with her in a specific physical way. Her hands were steady, but her shoulders had dropped in a way she couldn't seem to correct. And the headache behind her eyes was the kind that came from sustained adrenaline finally metabolizing. In the hallway outside the interview rooms, she stopped. Caleb was there, standing near the window where his daughter was sleeping in an oversized police sweatshirt. watching Nora's face the way parents watch sleeping children with something that isn't quite relaxation, because the vigilance never fully switches off, just changes its quality. He heard her coming and turned. They looked at each other across 10 feet of precinct hallway, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which felt appropriate given the specific nature of the evening they had shared. "They're putting you somewhere safe?" he asked. "Yes." She paused. "You? My sister's coming for Nora. I'll go home after that." He glanced toward the interview rooms. "FBI? They've been looking at the company for 7 months." She said it with the tone of someone who was still processing that information. "Agent Reyes. She's thorough." "Good." He seemed to mean it simply. Avery looked at Nora through the window. At the small shape of her under the sweatshirt, one hand tucked under her cheek. "She never looked," Avery said quietly. "You told her not to look, and she didn't. She's good at following instructions." A pause. "When she thinks they matter. She must trust you a lot." He looked at his daughter without answering immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. "She doesn't know what I used to do. I've made sure of that." Another pause. "She's going to have questions tomorrow. What will you tell her?" "The truth," he said, "most of it." He turned away from the window. "She's smart enough to know when she's not getting the whole picture. Better to give her what I can now than let her fill in the rest herself." Avery thought about that, about the particular calibration it required, knowing how much truth an 8-year-old could carry, and how much a father could bring himself to hand over. "That sounds hard." "Yeah," he said, "just that." She looked at him directly. He had a bruise developing along his left cheekbone, and his split lip had scabbed over, and he stood the way he had stood all night, not tense, not relaxed. Somewhere functional in between, like a man who had long since stopped thinking of stillness as a passive state. "I want to say something to you," she said, "and I need you to just let me say it without arguing." He waited. "I have spent a significant portion of my adult life believing that needing people was a liability, that the more self-sufficient I was, the safer I was. Professionally, emotionally, all of it." She held his gaze. "Tonight you sat across a restaurant from a complete stranger, and you got up from your dinner and walked toward 4 trained men with no weapon and no backup, and an 8-year-old daughter under a table, because you decided someone needed help." She stopped. "I can't make that make sense inside the framework I've been operating in. And I'm not sure I want to go back to operating in it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure I made a decision," he said. "Not the way you mean. It was less deliberate than that." That might be the most terrifying thing you could have said. Something shifted in his expression that might, under other circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. "You're going to be okay. The documents you have, that's the important thing. Everything else is processable." "Is that a technical term?" "In my experience." She nodded slowly. "Caleb, when this is over, when whatever is coming next has played itself out." She stopped, reconsidered, started again. "I'd like to be able to find you. Not for anything formal. She paused, and the pause was honest, which was something she had gotten out of the habit of. "I don't have many people who know what this was tonight, and I think that matters." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "It does." Douglas Hale was in his car on the Hutchinson River Parkway, heading north, when his phone rang for the 6th time in 40 minutes, and he finally answered it. The voice on the other end was not one of the 4 men he had sent. It was a voice he had hoped very much not to hear tonight, and the fact that he was hearing it meant that the insulation between himself and the evening's events had already been compromised. "Tell me what happened," the voice said. It belonged to a man named Carver, and Carver was the person who had, 4 years ago, approached Douglas with a proposition that Douglas had accepted, because the number had been large enough to make the risk seem theoretical. The risk had stopped being theoretical approximately 2 hours ago. "There was a complication," Douglas said. "I know there was a complication. Price and 3 others are in custody, and Avery Sterling is alive, and apparently has been talking to federal agents for the last hour. That's not a complication, Douglas. That's a catastrophe." A pause. "Who is the man?" I don't know yet. Price's contact said he was military, former, possibly." "Find out." The voice was very flat. "And understand something. The documents she was carrying tonight, even if Price and the others say nothing, the documents are enough to start a chain that leads to me. You understand what I'm telling you?" Douglas understood. He had understood since his phone started ringing at 10:15, and none of the 4 men he'd been waiting to hear from had been the ones calling. "There are other ways to handle the documents," Carver said. There are people who can move faster than a federal investigation. But I need to know if Avery Sterling is the only person who has seen the full picture. She hired a forensic accountant. His name is I Need Names. Tonight, Douglas pulled to the side of the parkway, his headlights illuminating a stretch of guardrail and beyond it, darkness. His hands were not steady on the wheel, and he was old enough and self-aware enough to know that the unsteadiness wasn't entirely fear. Some portion of it was the specific nausea of a man who had convinced himself for 4 years that the thing he was doing was contained, managed, unlikely to arrive at this particular exit on this particular night. He thought about Avery. He had known her for 7 years. He had watched her build the company through 3 near failures and 2 recoveries that should not have been possible, and the particular kind of relentless focus that he had once honestly admired. He had also watched her refuse to share control, refuse to be advised when advice conflicted with her instincts, refused to build the kind of political alliances within the board that might have made her safer. She was brilliant and she was isolated, and those 2 things together had made her, 4 years ago, look like someone who could be worked around. He had been wrong about that. He gave Carver the forensic accountant's name. He gave him 2 others. He stared at the guardrail while Carver ended the call without another word, and he sat there on the side of the Hutchinson River Parkway, in the dark, the engine running. And for a long time he didn't move. Call came to Agent Reyes's phone at 2:17 a.m. while she was in a conference room at the FBI field office on Federal Plaza reviewing the documents Avery had provided. It was from a field agent who had been running surveillance on Douglas Hale's residence for the past 6 hours as a precautionary measure, and what the agent told her made her sit forward in her chair and reach for her coffee and set it back down without drinking it. Hale's car had been found pulled over on the northbound shoulder of the Hutchinson River Parkway. Engine still running. No Douglas Hale. His phone had been left on the passenger seat. The last call had been 47 minutes ago to an unregistered number that pinged a tower in Westchester County and then went dead. Reyes called 3 numbers in quick succession and then put her hand flat on the conference table and looked at the documents spread in front of her, the shell company architecture, the account transfers, the 4 years of movement that had been buried in the gaps between quarterly reports and server migrations and the routine audits that Douglas Hale had for 4 years been the one to sign off on. The documents told a story. They told it clearly and in detail, the kind of detail that held up in federal court. But a story required all its pieces, and one of the most important pieces had just gotten into a car on the Hutchinson River Parkway and driven off the edge of the narrative. She called Avery Sterling's hotel room. It rang 4 times before Avery answered. Her voice not groggy but the alertness of someone who had not actually been asleep. "Miss Sterling," Reyes said, "I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. The forensic accountant you hired, where is he now?" Pause on the other end. When Avery spoke, her voice was careful in the way of someone making a calculation. "His name is Martin Fells. He has an office in Midtown and an apartment in Park Slope." "Why? Is there anyone outside of you and Mr. Fells who knows the full scope of what he found?" Another pause. "Longer. There's a copy," Avery said. "Complete copy of everything Fells compiled. I made it 2 weeks ago when I realized this might go further than I expected." Her voice was very controlled now. "It's not in my office, and it's not at my apartment. I sent it to someone I trust, with instructions not to open it unless I told them to, or unless they didn't hear from me within 48 hours. "Who?" "My sister. Her name is Dana. She teaches 3rd grade in Brooklyn." A pause. "She has no idea what's on the drive. She thinks she's holding on to financial documents for a legal dispute, which is technically not entirely inaccurate." Reyes let out a breath. "I need to speak to your sister tonight, Miss Sterling. Right now." "What happened?" Reyes told her. The silence on the other end of the line lasted approximately 4 seconds. "Douglas ran," Avery said. "It appears so, which means he's scared. Which means he's protecting someone above him." Her voice had changed, still controlled, but with something underneath it that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but had elements of both. "I always thought Douglas was the top. I thought he built this himself." "We're beginning to think differently," Reyes said carefully. "There's someone above him. That's what you're not saying. Miss Sterling, who is it?" "We don't know yet, but we will." Reyes picked up her pen, the name, your sister's full name and her address, and a number where she'll answer at 2 in the morning. Avery gave them. Then she said quietly, "The 4 men tonight. They weren't just hired hands. They were protection. Whatever is at the top of this, they were protecting it. Yes, Reyes said. That's what we believe. A pause. Then it's bigger than Douglas, Avery said. Not a question. Yes, another pause longer. Okay, Avery said. The word was very simple and very deliberate. The word of someone who has received information they don't like and has decided, consciously and immediately, what to do with it. Then we don't wait for them to come to us. We take this public before they can bury it. Miss Sterling, I need you to understand that a federal investigation requires. I understand what it requires. I'm not talking about doing this without you. I'm talking about making sure that by the time whoever is running this decides the investigation needs to disappear, there's a public record that makes it impossible. Her voice was steady and absolutely certain. I have the documents. I have the testimony. I have a restaurant full of witnesses and 4 men in custody and a forensic audit that took 6 weeks to build. A pause. And I have a man who walked into the middle of this tonight with nothing but his hands and his instincts and a daughter under a table. If he was willing to go that far, I can go a little further. Reyes was quiet. Get some sleep, Miss Sterling, she said finally. We'll talk in the morning. She hung up and looked at the documents on the table and thought about the scale of what she was looking at, not just a CFO who had stolen $2 billion, but the architecture above him, the network that had made that possible and protected it, and ultimately sent 4 professionals to a Manhattan restaurant on a Tuesday night to keep it buried. And she thought about the man in the worn jacket who had apparently walked into the middle of it because a child had looked up from her breadcrumbs and asked the right question, pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and began to write. Outside the window, Manhattan was doing what it always did at this hour, moving, lit, relentless, indifferent to the specific weight of any one night among all its nights. But some nights had weight that accumulated. This one was going to. Dana Sterling taught 3rd grade at a public school in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, and she had spent 7 years learning how to remain calm in situations that required it. A classroom of 23 8-year-olds on a Friday afternoon before a holiday break, parent-teacher conference with 2 parents who were not speaking to each other, a fire drill in February when half her students had forgotten their coats. She was good at calm. She had practiced it the way other people practiced an instrument. But when her phone rang at 2:34 in the morning and the woman on the other end identified herself as a federal agent and asked about a USB drive that her sister had mailed her 3 weeks ago with instructions not to open it, Dana sat up in bed and felt the calm she had spent 7 years building develop a significant crack. Is Avery okay? She said. Before anything else, before the drive, before whatever the agent needed. Is my sister okay? Your sister is safe, Reyes said. She's been cooperative with our investigation, and she's in a secure location. She asked me to tell you that she's sorry for calling this late, and that she'll explain everything as soon as she can. Dana released a breath. That sounds like her. She reached for the lamp on her nightstand. The drive. It's in my closet. She said it was financial documents. It is. We need it tonight, Miss Sterling. I can have agents at your address in 20 minutes. I'll be up, Dana said. She got the drive from the back of her closet where she had put it inside a shoebox, inside a larger box the day it arrived, because Avery had included a handwritten note that said only, "Keep this somewhere boring and don't think about it." Dana had done exactly that. She had not opened the shoebox again. She had not particularly thought about it, which, in retrospect, standing in her kitchen at 2:40 a.m., waiting for federal agents, seemed like either the best or worst instinct she'd ever followed. 2 agents arrived in 17 minutes. They were polite and efficient, and took the drive with a chain of custody form and a receipt, and left, and Dana stood in her kitchen after they were gone and called Avery's phone. It rang twice. "I'm okay," Avery said, answering. "I know. I'm sorry. What happened?" "Someone tried to take the company from me. Physically." A pause. "I'm fine. I got help from its own story. I'll tell you everything, but not tonight, Avery." Dana's voice went flat, in the way younger sisters' voices go flat when they are about to say something that has needed saying for a while. "You sent me a drive and told me to open it if I didn't hear from you. Do you understand what that means? That means you thought this might go badly enough. That. I know. You didn't call me. For 3 months, you've been dealing with this. And you didn't. I know, Dana. I know." A pause. "I didn't want to bring it to you. I'm your sister. I know what you are." The silence between them was the particular silence of 2 people who have had a version of this argument before, in different forms, across different years, about different things. It had always been about the same thing. Come home when this is over, Dana said finally. Even for a weekend. Come home and eat something that isn't from a restaurant. Yeah, Avery said. Her voice was quieter. Yeah, I will. By the time the sun came up over lower Manhattan on Wednesday morning, 3 things had happened that would define the next 30 days. The first was that the FBI, using the documentation from Avery's forensic audit and the recovered USB drive, had filed emergency warrants for the financial records of 7 shell companies connected to Sterling Meridian's Singapore subsidiary. The architecture of the fraud was, as the agent who briefed Reyes at 6A, M put it, elegant, the kind of thing that took genuine sophistication to build, and had been maintained with the attention of a system that expected to keep running indefinitely. The money had moved through the shells in rotating patterns, timed to coincide with the company's own legitimate transaction cycles, effectively camouflaging billions in unauthorized transfers as ordinary operational movement. The second thing was that Douglas Hale was found. Not by federal agents, by a toll camera on Interstate 95 north of New Haven, Connecticut, at 4:18 a.m. His face captured through the windshield of a car, registered to a name that cross-referenced to a shell entity connected, 3 layers down, the same Singapore network. He wasn't running north to Canada. He was running to a property in coastal Maine that the FBI had not previously known existed, and would not have found quickly without the toll camera image, which a sharp-eyed analyst in the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had flagged at 5:50 a.m., while cross-referencing the shell company records. State police intercepted the car outside Portland at 7:11 a.m. Douglas Hale was in the passenger seat. He was not driving. The man driving was identified as a private security contractor, with ties to 3 different overseas entities, which told Reyes, when she received the briefing, that Hale had not simply panicked and run. Someone had sent a car for him. Someone had moved him before the situation could fully close around him, which meant the network above Hale was faster than they'd anticipated. The third thing was that Avery Sterling at 7:45 a.m. called her communications director, her general counsel, and her personal attorney in a conference call from her hotel room and told them what she was going to do. Her general counsel's name was Paul Dietrich, and he had been Avery's lawyer for 5 years and had seen her make decisions he disagreed with before. He had gotten good at disagreeing clearly, and then, when she proceeded anyway, doing everything in his power to make sure she didn't get destroyed by the consequences. "You want to go public," he said. Not a question. The flat statement of a man preparing to calculate, before they can get ahead of it. Avery was sitting at the desk in the hotel room, a cup of coffee from room service that she had been drinking in the methodical way of someone fueling for work rather than enjoying anything. Carver, whoever he is, whatever his connection to this, he's already moved Hale. He's already trying to manage this from above. The moment we give him time to get lawyers and narrative control, this becomes a story about a corporate dispute and a financial irregularity. And suddenly I'm a CEO who can't manage her own house. If you go public before the FBI investigation is complete, I'm not going before the FBI is ready. I'm going simultaneously. She had already talked to Reyes about this. It had been a negotiation, and it had not been comfortable, but Reyes was smart enough to understand that the alternative, a controlled federal process that moved at federal speed, gave Carver's network months to restructure. They announced charges and execute warrants this morning. We release our own statement at the same time, not through the company's PR office directly. My name, my voice, my account of what I found, and when I found it and what was done to prevent me from reporting it. Including last night. Paul was quiet for a moment. Avery. The 4 men. The restaurant that's going to become the story. It's going to overshadow the financial crimes. Good, she said. He paused. Good, Paul, $1 billion fraud is abstract. People read about it, and they understand it's bad, and they move on with their day. But a CEO sitting alone in a restaurant and 4 men walking in to physically stop her from telling the truth, she set down her coffee. That's not abstract. That's a story people understand. That's a story that makes people angry. And angry people don't let things get buried. She paused. The fraud needs the human story to survive. Otherwise, it gets managed. Another silence. The man, Paul said carefully. The one who helped you. He's going to be part of this. I'm not going to use his name without his permission. But yes, what he did is part of this. She hesitated. It's relevant to the account of what happened. I can't give an accurate account and leave out the fact that 4 professionals were neutralized by a single man with no weapon who had his daughter with him. That's going to raise questions about who he is. He can choose how to answer those questions. That's his. Paul exhaled through his nose. She could hear him thinking, which after 5 years she had learned to read as accurately as speech. I need 4 hours. I need the draft reviewed by a second attorney and by the crisis PR firm. I need to see the FBI's press language before we coordinate timing, and I need you to eat something. I've been eating. You've been drinking coffee. Eat something. She looked at the untouched toast on the room service tray. Fine. 4 hours, he said. I'll call you back. Caleb had not slept. His sister Rosa had arrived at the precinct at 1:20 a.m. with the expression of a woman who had been managing her younger brother's crises for 30 years and had developed both genuine competence and a specific resigned affection for the task. She had taken Nora still asleep, barely stirring through the transfer from the precinct chair to the back seat of Rosa's car, and looked at Caleb with the look that meant, we are going to talk, but not tonight, and when we do I expect complete sentences. He had taken a cab back to his apartment in Queens at 2 in the morning and stood in his kitchen and looked at the ordinary clutter of it, the dishes in the drying rack, Nora's homework on the table, permission slip for a field trip that was still unsigned. He had signed the permission slip. Then he had sat down at the kitchen table and looked at nothing for a while. He was not processing the fight. The fight was processed. His body had catalogued it and would deliver a full accounting over the next several days in the form of stiffness and bruising. And the sharp complaint of his ribs every time he turned wrong. The events themselves were filed clean, sequential, finished. That was the training. It didn't stop working just because you didn't want it anymore. What he was sitting with was something different. Nora had woken up briefly in Rosa's car, not fully, just enough to register that she was moving and that her father was not there. She had said in the specific half-conscious voice of children between sleep and waking, "Is Dad okay?" And Rosa had said yes, and Nora had said okay and gone back to sleep. He had heard it through the open car window. She had been scared in that restaurant. She had done everything he asked, and she had stayed still and she had not looked, and she had come out of it without a visible mark. But the 8-year-old version of being scared doesn't vanish by morning. It settles somewhere and finds a shape and stays there, and it became one more thing that she would grow up carrying that he had not meant for her to carry. He was not a perfect father. He had understood that for a long time. He was frequently tired and occasionally impatient, and he had a way of going quiet when things were hard that Nora had learned to read as its own form of communication, which was not always fair to her. He had gaps that he didn't know how to fill, the things that came from being a certain kind of person in a certain kind of life, and then trying to become a completely different kind in the same lifetime. But she had been safe. Whatever else was true, she had been safe. He was still sitting at the kitchen table when his phone rang at 7:50 a.m. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. He answered anyway. Mr. Mercer. The voice was Reyes's. He recognized it from the precinct. I apologize for the early call. I have 2 things to tell you. Go ahead. First, Douglas Hale was apprehended this morning in Maine. He'll be in federal custody by this afternoon. The warrants on the Shell Company network were filed at 6 a.m. A pause. Second, Ms. Sterling is planning to make a public statement today, coordinated with our press announcement. She asked me to contact you first, because your involvement in last night's events will be part of the record. Another pause. She wanted you to know before it became public, and she wanted you to know that she will not use your name without your explicit consent. Caleb looked at the permission slip on the kitchen table. What does she need from me? He said. Nothing immediately. She understands that you may want to consult an attorney regarding your own statement. She also, Reyes paused. She asked me to tell you that whatever you decide, she supports it. He was quiet. The 4 men, he said, Price specifically. Is there a threat to consider? To me or to my daughter? We're treating Price and his associates as part of a larger contracted network. Until we have a clearer picture of who they ultimately answer to, I would recommend standard precautions, awareness of your surroundings. Any unusual vehicles or persons near your residence, that kind of thing. A careful pause. I also want to be honest with you. The man above Hale, we believe his name is Carver. No confirmed identity, yet he moved quickly last night. He's resourceful. We don't believe there's a specific active threat toward you, but we can't rule it out at this stage. Caleb absorbed this without any particular reaction, which itself was a kind of reaction. Okay, he said. There's one more thing. Price has requested to speak to you directly. A beat. No, Caleb said. Understood. I'll note your declination. Another pause. Mr. Mercer, what happened last night? You should know that it matters. Not just for Miss Sterling, but for the case. Your presence in that restaurant and your actions are the reason we have 4 individuals in custody, a cooperating lead witness, and physical access to documents that would otherwise have been destroyed or transferred by now. She said this carefully, not as flattery but as record. I've worked financial crimes for 11 years. The cases that come apart are the ones where the evidence chain breaks early. You kept this one intact. He didn't say anything for a moment. I was trying to get back to my daughter, he said. I know, Reyes said. That doesn't make what you did smaller. Statement went out at 11 o'clock. It was not the usual kind of corporate communication, the careful, lawyerly language designed to acknowledge without conceding, to inform without revealing, to convey appropriate gravity while minimizing exposure. Avery's communications director had pushed for that version, and Avery had listened politely and then rejected it entirely. What went out was a direct account, in Avery's voice, of everything. It began with the Singapore irregularity she had found 3 months ago, continued through the 6 weeks of forensic investigation. It described, without euphemism, the network of shell accounts and the 4 years of transfers. It named Douglas Hale by name. It stated clearly that Hale had been apprehended that morning in Maine while attempting to flee. And then it described Tuesday evening at Linden and Cross restaurant, not dramatically, not in the language of a thriller. In the plain, specific language of a woman reporting what had happened to her 4 men, professional and coordinated, who had entered the restaurant with the intention of forcing a biometric authorization that would have transferred $2 billion in fraudulent accounts before the evidence could be reported to federal authorities. And it described the man who had intervened. She did not name him. She described him as a former service member who had been present with his young daughter and who had, without weapon or backup, neutralized 4 trained individuals to ensure her safety and the safety of everyone in the restaurant. She wrote that she believed his actions represented something that went beyond bravery, because bravery is usually chosen in advance, and what he had done was something more immediate and more costly than a choice made from comfort. She wrote, he got up from dinner with his daughter and walked toward 4 dangerous men because he saw someone who needed help. He had no obligation to anyone in that room. He went anyway. I think about that, and I don't know what to call it except human. The specific human decision to do something hard for a stranger because the alternative was to stay in your seat and live with it. The statement closed with a direct address to the board of Sterling Meridian, to the company's employees, and to the investors who had trusted her. It said, the money that was stolen will be recovered. The people who built this scheme will answer for it in federal court. But I want to be clear about something that matters more to me than the financial accounting. Thousands of people who work for this company had their financial futures placed at risk by a group of men who believed that profit justified everything. It did not justify everything. It justified nothing. The recovered assets will not remain company property. They will be used to protect the people they were taken from. She had written that last paragraph herself at 5 in the morning in the hotel room while Paul Dietrich was asleep on the couch by the window. She had not shown it to him before it went out. She knew he would have had concerns, and she was past the part of this where concerns were useful. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, the statement had been read by 4 million people. By 3 o'clock, it had been shared enough that the number was no longer tracking cleanly. The financial press covered the fraud angle. The general news outlets covered Avery's account of the restaurant. Several outlets ran the line about the former service member and his daughter without context, which generated its own wave of commentary people trying to identify who he was, people expressing opinions about what he had done, people who had been in the restaurant that night beginning to tell their own versions of it, each version slightly different and slightly more dramatic than the one before. The phone calls to Caleb's cell number started at roughly 2 p.m. Numbers he didn't recognize, which he didn't answer, and one number he did, which was his sister, Rosa, who had seen the coverage and whose opening line was, Caleb, you need to tell me things. I know, he said. Are you and Nora safe? Yes, the FBI. Are they? I'm cooperating. It's fine. Caleb. She paused. It's on the news. There's a man described in a statement from this CEO, and I read the description and I thought I know who that is. It is my brother. And nobody told me. He closed his eyes briefly. I'm sorry it was late. I didn't want to. Don't tell me you didn't want to worry me. You took Nora to a restaurant and came out of it having fought 4 people, Caleb. I found out from the internet. I know. I'm sorry. She was quiet for a moment. Then Nora's asking questions. I know. I'm coming to get her today. I'll talk to her. She's not upset. Rosa paused, and when she spoke again her voice had changed, become something more careful. She's sort of proud, she said, and I am quoting her exactly. My dad helped that lady, and the bad guys didn't win. And she had breakfast, and she's been doing a puzzle for the last 2 hours, like it's a regular Wednesday. A beat. I don't know if that's healthy or if she's just 8. She's just 8, Caleb said. Probably both, Rosa said. Avery had been right about the public record, making certain things impossible to bury. By the end of Wednesday, 3 board members of Sterling Meridian had issued individual statements, expressing support for Avery's decision to disclose and explicitly distancing themselves from Douglas Hale. 2 of them had been in contact with Hale's faction of the board as recently as 6 weeks ago, which their lawyers would later argue was incidental, and which the federal investigation's communication records would later complicate significantly. The hostile acquisition attempt, which had been engineered not through the 4 men at the restaurant, but through a parallel legal mechanism that Hale's network had set in motion quietly, filing documents with a Delaware holding company that was itself a subsidiary of 2 of the Singapore shells, collapsed on Thursday when a federal judge signed a temporary injunction freezing all transactions by entities under active investigation. The injunction was broader than necessary, possibly, but the judge who signed it had read Avery's statement and had questions about the Delaware mechanism that required it to be addressed before anything else moved. On Friday morning, Douglas Hale appeared before a federal magistrate in a video conference from the facility in Portland where he had been processed. He was represented by 2 attorneys from a white shoe firm that had presumably been retained by someone above him in the network, which was itself a data point. He entered no plea. His attorneys requested bail and were denied. He looked, on the small screen in the federal courtroom, like a man who had been awake for 3 days and who understood, perhaps for the first time, the full material weight of the decisions he had made. Avery watched the hearing via a secured live stream in her lawyer's conference room. She had moved out of the hotel on Thursday and was staying temporarily at Paul Dietrich's guest apartment downtown, which was safer and more functional, and also happened to be 4 blocks from the federal prosecutor's office, which was where she was spending most of her time. She looked at Douglas Hale on the screen and felt less than she expected. Not nothing, but less. The anger that had been building for 3 months, the specific cold anger of someone who had been deceived by a person in a position of trust, had somewhere in the past 72 hours converted into something more functional. She didn't have a precise name for it. Purpose, maybe. Not a clean word, but close enough. After the hearing, she called her head of HR. Her head of HR was a woman named Claire Ossie, who had been with the company for 8 years, and who handled the news with the controlled steadiness of a person who had been dreading something like this and had therefore been quietly preparing. I need to know, Avery said, the number of employees whose retirement contributions were routed through the investment vehicles connected to the Singapore accounts. All of them. Every tier. I can have that number by end of day. And I need to know about the employees who left the company in the past 4 years under circumstances that may have been related to the scheme. People who were pushed out. People who were managed out to prevent them from asking the wrong questions. Claire was quiet for a moment. That's going to take longer to document properly. I know. Take the time you need to do it right. A pause. Nobody who is hurt by this is going to find out about a settlement by reading a press release. I'll contact them personally. All of them. Claire's voice was careful. Dozens of people. I know. That's an enormous personal. I know, Claire. Her voice was even. Set it up. The man named Carver was found on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the restaurant. He was not found through a dramatic operation or a coordinated raid. He was found because the forensic accountant Martin Fells, who had been placed in protective housing by the FBI on Wednesday night when Reyes's team identified that his name had been passed to an unknown party by Douglas Hale in his 2A. Phone call had, in 6 weeks of investigation, noticed a recurring signatory pattern in 3 of the shell companies, a name that appeared as a tertiary authorized representative on accounts that should not have had tertiary signatories at all, buried in the administrative structure of a Cayman entity that itself had no obvious connection to Sterling Meridian. The name was a legal alias for a man named Richard Carver, 61, who had spent 20 years in private equity and the last 8 as the principal of a fund of funds structure that had, among its portfolio companies, several entities connected to Sterling Meridian's board before Avery's tenure. He was arrested at his home in Greenwich, Connecticut at 6:15 a.m. while his coffee was still brewing. Reyes called Avery 40 minutes later. "It's him," she said. "We have enough. There will be more charges as the investigation continues, but we have enough for the initial arrest." Avery was standing at the window of the guest apartment, watching the early morning light on the street below. "Carver," she said. "Do I know him?" "You've been in the same room with him twice. He attended Sterling Meridian board dinners in 2019 and 2020 as a guest of one of the founding board members who is no longer with the company." Thought back. 2019, 2020, the early years of her tenure, when the board dinners had been larger and more political, before she had restructured the governance and reduced the guest list. She had shaken hands with dozens of men at those dinners. She could not put a face to the name. "He was there the whole time," she said. "Before you found the Singapore report, before the forensic audit, yes." She let that land. 4 years. The scheme had been running since before she had been CEO, had continued through her entire leadership, had been maintained by a man she had met at a board dinner and could not remember, who had watched her build the company around a financial architecture that was quietly eating it alive from the inside. "Okay," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me before the press release," Reyes said. "Thank you." A pause. "Is it over?" "The arrests are over. The investigation isn't. There will be other names that come out of this as we continue to work through the network. It may take a year, possibly more." Reyes paused. "But the active threat, yes. It's over." Avery nodded, which was a response she couldn't transmit through a phone but made anyway. "There's one more thing," Reyes said. "Price. He's been offered a reduced charge in exchange for testimony. We expect he'll accept. His statement about the network above Hale was part of what let us move on Carver as quickly as we did. He talked when he understood the scale of who he was protecting, yes. He talked." A pause. "He also asked again about Caleb Mercer. He wanted it known that he had no interest in retaliation, that whatever he'd been hired to do was finished when the arrest happened." Avery thought about that, about the economy of violence in that world, the specific professional code of it, which she didn't agree with but understood was real. "Did you pass that along to Caleb?" "I did." He said. Reyes paused, and something in her voice suggested she was close to Rye. He said, "Good to know," and asked if there was anything else. Avery looked at the street below. A delivery truck. A woman walking a dog, the ordinary machinery of a city morning, indifferent and continuous. "That sounds right," she said. She called Caleb that afternoon. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had her number saved, which she found she was glad about. "Carver's in custody," she said. A pause. "How are you?" She stopped, reconsidered. She had spent 30 years giving automatic answers to that question, and she was making an effort in the aftermath of this week to stop doing that. "I'm tired. Not in a bad way. Tired the way you are when something that was very heavy has been set down." "Yeah," he said. "I know that feeling. Is Nora okay?" "She's okay. She's staying with my sister for a few more days, until things quiet down." "Has she asked questions?" "A lot of them." A brief pause. She wanted to know why people would do something like that. Take someone else's things. Hurt someone to get what they want. He was quiet for a moment. "I told her that some people convince themselves that the rules other people have don't apply to them, that they're smart enough or important enough that normal things don't count. And usually someone lets them believe that long enough that they start building a life around it." Avery was quiet. "What did she say?" she asked. "She said that was stupid." A pause. "And then she asked if you were okay, specifically. She remembered your face." Something moved in Avery's chest that she chose not to examine too closely. "Tell her yes. Tell her I said thank you for staying under the table." She heard something that might have been an exhale through a almost smile. "She'll like that," he said. They were both quiet for a moment, which was a different kind of quiet than the precinct hallway had been. Less loaded. More like two people sitting at the same distance from the same event and not needing to fill the space between them with anything that wasn't true. "I want to talk to you," Avery said. "Not about legal matters or the investigation. About what comes next. For the company, for the employees, for..." She stopped. "There's something I want to build. And I think you might be the right person to help me figure out how." Caleb was quiet for a beat. What kind of something? Something that means people don't have to wait for someone like you to happen to be in the room, she said. Pause. That's worth a conversation, he said. Saturday, she said. Somewhere with better lighting than a police precinct. Somewhere with food, he said. I didn't finish my steak. She laughed briefly, quietly, the specific laugh of someone who had not laughed at anything in several days and was slightly surprised by the sound of it. Saturday, she said. She hung up and turned back to the window in the ordinary street below. The delivery truck was gone. The woman with the dog was gone. A man was standing on the corner reading his phone, and a kid on a bicycle was threading between the parked cars, and the light was doing what October light did in New York at this hour, going golden and specific and briefly, almost against its will. Beautiful. She had a company to rebuild. She had employees to call personally one by one. She had a board to restructure, a legal process to survive, a public record to maintain in the months that came next. She had a sister she had promised to visit and a father's watch on her wrist that she checked not for the time but out of habit, the way you touch something that grounds you. She had a lot of work. She was not afraid of the work. For the first time in a long time, she was also not doing it alone, not entirely, not in the way she had been, and that was different in a way she was still learning how to carry. Picked up her phone and called Claire Ossie. Give me the list, she said. And she got to work. The Saturday meeting happened at a diner in Midtown, Caleb's suggestion, which Avery had accepted without negotiation. It was the kind of place that had been on the same corner for 30 years, and showed it. Laminated menus, coffee that arrived before you asked, booths with the specific wear pattern of 10,000 ordinary conversations. The lighting was fluorescent and honest, and nobody in the room was there to be seen. Caleb was already in the booth when Avery arrived, 12 minutes late because her car had been stopped in traffic on 6th Avenue, and she had eventually gotten out and walked the last 6 blocks, which had felt good in a way she hadn't expected. The cold air, the movement, the anonymous crowds on the sidewalk who had no idea who she was and no interest in finding out. He had coffee. He had ordered nothing else, which she recognized as a form of courtesy waiting. She sat down a flat across from him, and a waitress appeared, and she ordered coffee and scrambled eggs without looking at the menu, because she had been so thoroughly not eating for the past 5 days that her body had started submitting requests with unusual directness. You look better than Tuesday, Caleb said. You look worse, she said. The bruise along his cheekbone had developed fully dark and specific, not the kind of thing that could be mistaken for anything other than what it was. Yeah, he touched it briefly, the way you touch something you've stopped noticing. It'll fade. They talked for a while about the practical things first, because that was how both of them operated the case. What was public? What was still moving through the legal process? Richard Carver had retained a team of 6 attorneys and was contesting several of the warrant procedures, which Race had told Avery was expected and not particularly concerning. The forensic chain was solid. The shell company records, once the Singapore Financial Authority, had cooperated with the FBI's international request, which had taken 48 hours of bureaucratic pressure, were comprehensive enough that the case did not depend on Carver's cooperation or confession. Douglas Hale had entered a guilty plea on the first 3 counts in exchange for reduced charges on the remaining 9, which had surprised exactly no one. He was going to prison. The precise length was still being determined. Price and his team had been charged separately. Price's testimony about the network had been, as Reyes described it, detailed and credible, the testimony of a professional who had decided that the people above him had not held up their end of an implicit bargain and therefore were owed nothing. He was looking at a reduced sentence in federal custody. Garrett, Roth, and Vasquez had followed his lead. All 4 of them would do time. The hostile acquisition mechanism, the Delaware Holding Company, the documents that had been quietly filed while the restaurant operation was supposed to be neutralizing the immediate threat had been unwound by court order. Sterling Meridian's board had ratified Avery's emergency governance resolution, which restructured the approval requirements for major financial transactions and added 2 independent oversight positions that had not existed before. It was not a perfect system. Avery had said that clearly in the board meeting, where she presented it not to undersell it, but because she had stopped believing in perfect systems and thought the board should too. The scrambled eggs arrived. She ate them while they talked, which was not particularly elegant, and she didn't particularly care. "Thing I want to build," she said, setting down her fork. I've been thinking about how to describe it in a way that doesn't sound like a corporate initiative. How does it sound when you try? Like a corporate initiative. Then describe it the other way first. She looked at him. What happened in that restaurant? 4 trained men walked into a room full of people, and the only person who knew what was happening was you. Everyone else was either frozen or unaware or both. She paused. Not because they were cowardly, because they didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't have the language for it. The signs were there, the way those men moved, the way they positioned themselves, the way the camera went dark and nobody read them except you. She picked up her coffee. Most people spend their entire lives without ever being in a room where that kind of threat is present. But the skills that let you read that room, those skills translate to everything. Recognizing when a colleague is in trouble. Knowing when a work situation is becoming unsafe. Understanding how to respond to a crisis without making it worse. She paused. I want to build a program that teaches those skills to ordinary people. Not combat training. Not security certification. The human skills underneath all of that: observation, de-escalation, how to stay functional when you're scared. Caleb had been listening without expression, which she had learned was how he listened when he was taking something seriously, rather than when he wasn't interested. For your employees, he said, to start, and then as a model that other companies can replicate. Open source the curriculum, let it spread. She met his eyes. I want you to help design it. Not run it as a security function. I have people for operational security. Design it. Bring what you know about how people actually respond under pressure and build something that helps people who will never be SEALs and will never need to be. She paused. You told me you didn't want to become the man you used to be. This isn't that. This is using what you learned without going back to where you learned it. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. Nora asked me something, he said. Avery waited. She asked why I went over to help you. When I'd told her specifically that we were there to eat dinner and not get into anyone else's business, he half smiled, which pulled at the bruise on his cheekbone. She's very literal about established rules. She thought I'd contradicted myself. What did you tell her? I told her that there are rules we make before we understand the situation, and then there's the situation. And sometimes the situation is different enough from what you imagined that the rule stops applying. And you have to be honest about which one you're actually in. He paused. She thought about it and said that made sense, but she still thought I should have called the police faster. She's not wrong. No, he said. She's not. Avery looked at him. At the honest tiredness in his face and the bruise in the worn jacket, that was probably the same one he'd been wearing Tuesday night, washed since, and at the specific way, he held himself the posture that looked like stillness, but was something more alert than that. Constant quiet readiness of a person who had learned to live at a slightly elevated level of attention and could not entirely turn it off. Will you do it? She said. He looked at her for a moment. Not as an employee, he said. I'm not interested in going on your payroll. Consultant. Independent contract. Your terms. I keep my work. The HVAC business. I don't want to be dependent on a single. Completely understood. You set your hours. You set your involvement. She paused. The only thing I'd ask is that you take it seriously, not as a side project. If I say yes to something, I take it seriously. I know, she said. That's why I'm asking you. Another pause. Yeah, he said. Okay. She nodded. No celebration, no excessive gratitude. Just the simple acknowledgement of 2 people who had agreed on something that mattered. One condition, he said. What? Nora gets to know what the program is, not the details. But she knows her father's doing something that uses. He paused, looking for the word. Things he knows. In a way that helps people. He met her eyes. She's been wondering what to do with Tuesday night. Having a shape to put it in will help. Avery felt something shift in her chest that she had been feeling at intervals since the precinct hallway. The sensation of encountering a way of thinking about the world that was not hers and that she had perhaps needed to encounter for a long time. Of course, she said. The months that followed were not simple, and Avery would have been suspicious if they had been. The federal trial process was long and procedurally exhausting in the way federal cases always were: delays, motions, appeals on warrant procedures that Carver's legal team pursued with the specific tenacity of people being very well paid. Avery attended every hearing she was required to attend, and some she wasn't. She sat in the federal courthouse on Worth Street on a November morning when Richard Carver was formally arraigned on 19 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, and she watched him stand at the defense table, in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, flanked by attorneys, and she looked for the moment when he looked at her, and she could confirm for herself that he was real and specific and not the abstract threat she had been carrying for months. He looked at her once, briefly, with the expression of a man who had made his calculations and was committed to them, whatever they cost. She looked back without flinching. She thought, I built something you tried to take. You didn't take it, and now here we are. The trial date was set for the following spring. In the meantime, the investigation continued to turn over additional connected entities, 3 more individuals, whose names appeared in the shell company authorization records and who were, over the course of the fall and early winter, variously charged, arrested, or named as cooperating witnesses. The network proved to be larger than Reyes's original assessment and smaller than the most paranoid version, which was about how these things usually went. Avery stayed in contact with Reyes throughout. It became a working relationship, functional and honest, and occasionally, on the phone calls that ran longer than the case required, something approaching the kind of conversation you have with someone whose thinking you respect. You know what bothers me? Avery said to her, on a Thursday evening in December, sitting in her actual office for the first time in weeks, the city going dark through the windows. Tell me, Ray said. I was careful. For 3 months I was so careful. Paid the forensic accountant in cash. I used a separate phone for calls related to the investigation. Told nobody. She paused, and they still knew. They found out that Tuesday, within hours of me, getting the final audit results, and they moved that same night. Which means someone was watching me that I never identified. Some part of their observation of me that I didn't catch. Reyes was quiet for a moment. We identified the source 3 weeks ago. I was going to tell you in person, but a pause. A junior analyst in your legal department. He was on Hale's payroll. His job was simply to flag any activity from the forensic firm in the company's communication systems. Your accountant used a company database to cross-reference one transaction record. That generated a system flag. The analyst saw it and reported. Avery absorbed that. Someone in my legal department. He's been charged. He's cooperating. How old is he? Paused. 26. She looked at the city through the windows. 26 years old, making what was probably not a large amount of money, and someone had offered him more, and he had made a decision that was going to define the next decade of his life in ways he had probably not fully imagined when he made it. I want to know what he was being paid, she said. Avery, I'm not going after him, additionally. I just want to know what the number was. What it cost to compromise someone for something like this. Reyes told her. The number was not large. It was the kind of number that sounded significant to a 26-year-old paying student loans and New York rent, and was, in the scheme of $2 billion, essentially rounding error. Okay, Avery said. She didn't say anything else about it that evening. But she thought about it on the subway home. She had started taking the subway again, which felt important in a way she hadn't fully articulated, and she thought about the distance between what things cost and what they were worth, and how often those two numbers lived in entirely different universes, and how easy it was to confuse them when you were young and tired, and not yet able to see far enough ahead to understand that the short money and the long cost were coming out of the same account. The employee fund was established in November, 6 weeks after the arrests. It was not established quietly. Avery announced it in a company-wide meeting, not a video address, not a written memo, a meeting she conducted in the largest conference room the company had, with overflow rooms connected by video for the employees who couldn't fit, and she stood at the front without notes and told them, all of them, what had happened and what she intended to do about it. The number she announced for the fund was significant. Not everything that had been recovered the legal process was still determining the full recovery amount, and she was not going to make promises she couldn't precisely keep but enough to cover the retirement shortfalls that Claire Osie's team had documented, with a reserve for ongoing emergency assistance, and a commitment to revisit the fund annually as recoveries continued. She also announced the scholarship program. She described it simply, for the children and dependents of employees who had suffered material harm as a result of the fraud. Education costs from high school through graduate and professional programs, covered in full for qualifying dependents. No application process more complicated than a single form. Administered by an independent nonprofit board with no Sterling Meridian management involvement, so that no one who applied ever had to wonder whether their application was being read by someone who knew them. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then a woman in the third row, Avery would later learn her name was Patricia, and that she had been with the company for 11 years in the accounts receivable department, and that her son was in his second year of college, and that the fraud had reduced her retirement account by roughly 40%, raised her hand and said, "Is this real? Like, this is actually happening?" "Yes," Avery said, "this is actually happening." The woman nodded once, very slowly, and looked down at her hands. And the room stayed quiet for another moment that felt, to Avery, like one of the most honest silences she had ever stood inside. Caleb came to the company's main office for the first time in late November. He came on a Tuesday, which neither of them mentioned. He wore a different jacket from the one he'd had at the restaurant, darker, slightly less worn, and he carried a legal pad and a thermos of coffee, which made Avery's communications director, who had briefly prepared a full beverage spread for the meeting, visibly uncertain about the protocol. They met in a conference room on the 14th floor with Claire Osei, the company's head of learning and development, and a woman named Frances Yee, who ran crisis response training for a nonprofit and whom Avery had spent 2 weeks convincing to join the design process. Frances was 60, direct, deeply practical, and had spent 20 years teaching people how to survive situations they hadn't anticipated. She and Caleb spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting figuring out whether they agreed on anything fundamental, which they did, and disagreeing about approach, which they also did, in the specific productive way of two people who wanted the same outcome and had different experiences of what actually worked. Avery mostly listened. She listened to Caleb describe the difference between training that made people feel safer and training that actually made people safer, which were not the same thing and frequently in tension. She listened to Francis push back on his instinct toward individual skill building, arguing that the more useful intervention was structural, that organizations needed protocols, not just capable individuals. She listened to Caleb concede that point and then argue that protocols were only as good as the people inside them, and that the protocols broke down exactly when the individual most needed to be capable. She listened to Francis say, "Yes, so we build both." She watched Caleb write something on the legal pad in the handwriting of a man who had never been concerned about whether his handwriting was legible to anyone else. She thought about Tuesday night and the 4 months that had followed, and about the specific series of accidents and decisions that had brought all of them to this room on this Tuesday in November: a rounding error in a quarterly report, a forensic accountant, a restaurant with bad timing, a father who didn't like getting into other people's business and had gotten into it anyway. None of it had been inevitable. Any link in that chain could have broken differently. If the Singapore report had been off by a different amount, she might have looked at it and moved on. If she had sat in a different section of the restaurant, if Caleb and Nora had wanted to eat somewhere else that night, she had thought about that a lot over the past 4 months, the contingency of it, the way large things depended on small accidents. It had bothered her for a while, the idea that her survival had required a specific Tuesday and a specific table and a specific 8-year-old asking about breadcrumbs. It had felt like the wrong kind of luck, not earned, not built, just happened. But she had talked to Dana about it over the phone one evening, Dana, who had a third grader's worldview professionally absorbed into her own, and who was therefore not interested in overthinking things that had already happened. "You found the fraud," Dana had said. "You. Nobody found it for you. You didn't stop when it got complicated, and you didn't quit when it got scary. And then when it got dangerous, someone helped you." A pause. It's not luck. That's you doing the right thing and someone else doing the right thing at the same time. Those overlap sometimes. That's just how things work. Avery had sat with that, how things work. Not elegant, not designed. Just the occasional overlap of two people doing the right thing at the same time, in the same room, without coordinating in advance. It wasn't a comfortable philosophy, but it was honest. The curriculum took 4 months to build, which was longer than any of them had planned, and shorter than it probably should have taken, given the scope of what they were trying to do. It was revised 11 times. It was piloted with 3 groups of Sterling Meridian employees in January and February, and the feedback sessions after each pilot were, as Francis described them, humbling people pointed out the gaps that the designers couldn't see because they were too close to the content, and the gaps were significant and real, and required genuine revision rather than cosmetic adjustment. Caleb ran the pilot sessions himself, which had not been the original plan. The original plan had been for trained facilitators to run them with Caleb in an advisory role. But the first pilot session, run by a facilitator who had prepared carefully and knew the material well, had produced a specific kind of careful, polished engagement from the participants that told Caleb the thing he was most worried about. People were learning the content without believing it. He told Avery this after the first session. She said, "So what do you need?" He said, "I need to be in the room." She said, "Then be in the room." He was in the room. And the difference was immediately apparent in the way it's always apparent when the person teaching something has actually done it. Not the content changed, the same curriculum, but the texture of the delivery. The moments where Caleb paused and said something like, "This next part is the part that people get wrong consistently, because under real pressure, your brain does a specific thing that your training tells you not to do, and both of them are trying to help you, and one of them is wrong." And the room leaned forward in a way it hadn't before. He was not, as a teacher, what anyone would have called polished. He didn't have the smooth facilitation cadences of professional trainers. Paused in the wrong places. He sometimes gave answers that were more complicated than the question required, and sometimes simplified things that deserved more nuance. He occasionally lost the thread of his own point and had to back up, which he did without apparent embarrassment, which was itself a kind of teaching. But he was honest in a way that the material required. When participants asked what it actually felt like to be in a dangerous situation, not theoretically, but in the body, he answered, not with war stories, with specifics about the physiological reality, what the hands do, what the vision does, what the internal monologue sounds like, and why it can be trusted or not trusted. He talked about his daughter under the table in a restaurant, because it was the most recent example, and because it was true, and because the fact that the most frightening moment of that evening was returning to that corner and not knowing what he'd find more frightening than any of the men he had faced was important information about what mattered and why. By the third pilot session, participants were asking questions that went beyond the curriculum. By the fourth session, Avery sat in the back of the room and watched and did not say anything afterward, because there was nothing she needed to say. The trial of Richard Carver began in April and ran for 7 weeks. Avery testified for 2 days. She had been prepared by the prosecution team with the thoroughness of people who had learned to expect the other side's best efforts, and the cross-examination was, as expected, a systematic attempt to reframe her discovery of the fraud as motivated by a pre-existing desire to consolidate power and eliminate board members who disagreed with her management. It was not a stupid argument. It had enough proximity to certain truths about her she was controlling. She was not a consensus builder. He had made enemies that it required careful navigation rather than flat denial. She navigated it carefully. She denied what was untrue and conceded what was true, and did not confuse the two, which the prosecution team had told her was exactly what they needed from her, and which she had found easier to commit to than she'd expected, because the past 6 months had produced in her a significant impatience with anything that required her to be less than direct. When the cross-examination pushed her on whether she had acted alone in the investigation, whether the forensic audit, the private accountant, the months of quiet documentation were the actions of a CEO working appropriately within her governance structure, she said clearly, no. I acted without informing the board because I had reason to believe the board's information security had been compromised, which subsequent events confirmed. Was that optimal governance? Probably not. Was it the right decision? Yes. Carver's attorney looked at her. So you're saying you knew better than the process? I'm saying the process had a hole in it that someone was exploiting, and I worked around the hole. If the hole hadn't been there, I would have used the process. She paused. Fixing the hole is what the past 6 months have been. The jury deliberated for 9 days. They found Richard Carver guilty on 16 of 19 counts. The 3 counts on which he was acquitted were, as Reyes explained to Avery in a brief phone call after the verdict, the 3 where the evidence chain was most dependent on Hale's testimony, which the defense had successfully complicated. It was not a perfect outcome. Is it enough? Avery asked. For sentencing? Yes, Reyes said. It's enough. Avery nodded. Are you okay? Reyes asked. She thought about it honestly. I'm relieved. I'm tired in a way that I think is going to take longer to resolve than the case took. She paused. I keep thinking about the 26-year-old in the legal department. Reyes was quiet. I know, she said. He made a decision he can't unmake. Because someone figured out the number that would make him feel like it was worth it. Avery looked at her office window. City. The ordinary afternoon of it. I keep thinking about the employees who lost retirement savings they spent decades building, and the young man who helped take it for the number that someone decided was his price. She paused. There's something about that I can't fully make peace with. The gap between those two things. There isn't always peace with it, Reyes said carefully. Sometimes you just carry it and keep going. Is that what you do? 11 years of financial crimes? Yes, Reyes said. That's pretty much exactly what I do. In May, 6 months and 3 weeks after a Tuesday evening at Linden and Cross Restaurant, Avery's foundation held its first scholarship event. It was not a gala. She had specifically rejected the gala format, the formal dinner, the silent auction, celebrities presenter, the whole apparatus of philanthropic self-congratulation that she had attended too many of, and found both exhausting and slightly dishonest about what it was actually celebrating. This was a lunch in the company's largest conference facility, with the scholarship recipients and their families and the employees of Sterling Meridian, who had been most directly affected by the fraud, and who had, in various ways, contributed to the investigation or the documentation, or simply to the company's survival of the past 7 months. There were 41 scholarship recipients in the first cohort. The youngest was 7, the daughter of an employee who had been managed out of the company in 2022 and 2s. In circumstances the investigations determined were directly related to his proximity to the fraud's internal structure. He had been quietly offered a settlement as part of the overall employee remediation process, and his daughter's scholarship was one of the first applications Claire's team had processed. The oldest recipient was 23, a young man whose mother had worked in the Singapore office and whose family had been financially affected by the subsidiary restructuring that the fraud had necessitated. He was in his first year of a graduate program in financial forensics, which Avery had found out only when she read his application materials, and which she had thought about more than once since. Caleb was there. He had come with Nora, who was wearing a dress that Rosa had clearly had a significant role in selecting, and who had been told enough about the scholarship program, simply clearly, in the way Caleb explained things to her to understand what the day was. Avery found them near the window at the edge of the room, Nora watching the proceedings with her father's particular quality of alert attention, taking in the people and the room and drawing her own conclusions. Avery crouched down. "Hi," she said. Nora looked at her.
"Hi."
A pause. "Your company gave those kids scholarships." "Yes." "Because bad people stole money from the company and those families got hurt." "Yes." "That's right." Nora thought about this, and now the bad people are in trouble. Yes, another pause. "My dad helped," Nora said. Not proudly, exactly, more as a statement of record, factual and clean. "He did," Avery said, "a lot." Nora looked at her father. "He doesn't like talking about it." "I know." Avery glanced up at Caleb, who was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has decided to let a conversation happen without his participation. Some people do their most important things quietly. Nora appeared to consider whether this was satisfactory. "He fixed our heater last winter, too," she said. "He also doesn't talk about that." Caleb said quietly, "Nora, what?" "You don't." Avery stood up and looked at Caleb, and the thing that had no precise category moved through her again, warmer now, less surprising, settling into something that had had months to find its shape. "Thank you for coming," she said. "She wanted to see it," he said, meaning Nora. "I know." A pause. "I'm glad you both did." The ceremony was simple. The recipients came forward in small groups, by family, and received a folder with the scholarship documentation and a brief personal note from Avery written individually, not templated, which had taken her 3 weeks, and which Paul Dietrich had told her was an insane use of her time, and which she had done anyway. When the last group had come forward and returned to their seats and the room settled into the particular warmth of an afternoon that had gone the way it was supposed to go, Avery stood at the front and said a few things. She said that the people in this room represented 2 different kinds of loss, the financial, which could be repaired, and the time, which could not, and that she wanted to acknowledge both, without pretending they were equivalent. She said that the fund and the scholarships were not reparations in the legal sense, and were not intended to be, but that she believed in the obligation to do more than the minimum that the law required, and that this was her attempt to define what more looked like. She said that the company was a different place than it had been a year ago, not finished, not perfect, not anywhere close to either, but different in ways that she intended to maintain. because the events of the past year had made certain kinds of self-deception very difficult to sustain. She did not say, "A man in a worn jacket at a corner table changed something in me that I am still in the process of understanding." She did not say that because it was true in a way that was still becoming clear to her, and things that were still becoming clear belonged in private until they had finished arriving. But she thought it. She looked at Caleb at the edge of the room, standing with Nora's hand in his, watching the proceedings with the alert stillness that she had come to recognize as his natural state. The posture of a man who never fully stopped paying attention, not because he was paranoid, but because paying attention was how he expressed care. He was watching the scholarship recipients. He was watching their families. His face held something that was not sentiment. Caleb Mercer was not a sentimental man, but was something adjacent to it. The expression of a person who has watched an outcome arrive that cost something real and feels the weight of both the cost and the outcome at the same time. She finished speaking. The room applauded. Nora, Avery noticed, clapped with both hands raised, the specific enthusiastic clapping of children who haven't learned to make it look casual yet. Afterward, when most of the guests had begun to filter out and the catering team was quietly reorganizing the room, Caleb found her near the window where she had drifted to get a few minutes of the city outside the glass. "Kid with the forensics degree," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The one in the back row. He's going to come after things like this for a living." "I know," she said. "I read his application twice. Good investment. He'd be insulted by that framing." "Probably," Caleb said. "But it's also true." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city. "I want to ask you something," Avery said, "and I need you to answer honestly rather than diplomatically." "I'm not particularly diplomatic." "No," she said. "You're not. That's why I'm asking." She turned from the window. "Program. The curriculum. How do you feel about it not as a project, but as a thing in the world? Does it do what you hoped?" He thought about it. Not quickly, actually thought about it. "It does something I hoped," he said. "It makes people more aware, less likely to freeze, better at asking for help before the situation requires it." He paused. "Does it do everything?" "No. There are limits to what you can teach in a conference room that only becomes real when you're actually in it." He paused again. "But I think about Nora asking me why those men were surrounding that woman. 8 years old. She saw it immediately, not because she was trained, but because she was paying attention. That's what the program is really teaching. The paying attention part." He looked at the room. Most adults have learned to stop doing that. They've learned to look at a situation and see the normal version of it, because the normal version is almost always right. The program is about making people willing to consider that the situation might not be the normal version, even briefly, even just long enough to ask a question. Avery was quiet. "That's not a corporate initiative," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She turned back to the window. She thought about the rounding error in the Singapore quarterly report, the number that had been wrong in a way that was easy to look at and attribute to a data entry mistake and move on. She had not moved on. She had not been able to explain, at the time, why she hadn't some stubbornness, some instinct, the specific dissatisfaction of a mind that didn't like unexplained things. But it was the same thing, really. It was the willingness to let the situation be what it actually was instead of the normal version. Some people called that suspicion. Some people called it caution. She had started thinking of it simply as honesty about what you were looking at. "Nora's okay?" she said. "She's fine. She's over there eating someone's leftover dessert." A brief pause. "She asked me a few months ago whether I would do it again. If it happened again. Go over to help someone." Avery looked at him. "What did you say?" I said yes. He didn't elaborate immediately. "Then I told her that the question isn't whether you're going to be in a situation where someone needs help. That's not something you decide. The question is what kind of person you're going to be when you're in it. And you build the answer to that question over a long time, not in the moment. The moment just shows you what you already built." The room was nearly empty now. The caterers were folding the last of the linen, and through the glass the city was doing what it did, at this hour, on a May afternoon bright and loud and completely indifferent to the specific weight of any individual day among all its days. Caleb had spent 5 years trying to separate himself from the person he had been, not because that person was bad, but because the life built around him was. What Tuesday night had proved, in a way he was still sorting through, was that the separation was not as complete as he had constructed it. The skills were still there. The instincts were still there. And the question he had been sitting with, ever since the question underneath the curriculum and the consulting and the careful new arrangement of his life, was whether that was a problem or a fact. He had arrived gradually at fact. Not every fact is a problem. Some facts are just things you carry, and the question is what you do with the carrying. He carried what he knew into conference rooms and pilot sessions and conversations with Francis Yee about structural versus individual intervention, and he carried it into the mornings when he drove to job sites and fixed the systems that kept buildings alive. And he carried it into evenings with Nora doing homework at the kitchen table, where he was the father who fixed things and packed lunches and signed permission slips, and also, now, the father who worked on something she understood made people safer. Both of those people were him. He had stopped trying to decide which one was the real one. Avery had started with a rounding error in a quarterly report. She had ended, or rather, arrived, because there was no real ending in the work she had committed to in a place her 30-year-old self would not have recognized. Not because the company was different, though it was. Because she was. The specific brittleness of someone who had made self-sufficiency into an ideology had been broken in a Manhattan restaurant on a Tuesday night in October, and she had not rebuilt it, and she didn't intend to. She still closed the door of the corner office when she needed to think. She still made decisions that her board thought were too fast and her lawyers thought were too direct. She still had the particular impatience of someone who could see what needed to happen before other people had finished mapping the problem. But she called Dana more. She answered questions with less certainty. She had sat with Reyes once, over coffee that had nothing to do with the case, and listened to 11 years of financial crimes compressed into 2 hours of conversation, and had found it more useful than most of the executive coaching she had paid for over the years. She had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that needing people wasn't a liability. It was just accurate. It was just true. And there was something in her that had always valued truth above other things, and it turned out that applied here too, as soon as she was willing to look at it directly. Nora appeared at Caleb's elbow, holding a napkin that had clearly once contained a piece of cake. Her dress had a small frosting mark on the sleeve that Rosa was going to have thoughts about. "Can we go?" she said. Not rudely, just with the directness of a person who has decided the event has reached its natural conclusion. Caleb looked at Avery. "We can go," he said. "To Avery? Saturday?" "Saturday," she said. Nora looked between them. "What Saturday?" "Meeting," Caleb said. "About the program?" "About the program." Nora absorbed this with a small nod, apparently satisfied. She looked at Avery with her father's eyes, the same quality of assessment, the same willingness to land on what she saw without flinching. "My dad's good at this," she said. "What he does." "For your program." "I know," Avery said. "He doesn't like it when people say that." "I know that too." Nora appeared to find this adequately informative. She turned and headed for the door with the purposefulness of a child who has somewhere to be. Caleb looked at Avery for a moment, the specific look of two people who have been through something together that changed the shape of things and are still, months later, finding out exactly what the new shape is. "See you Saturday," he said. "See you Saturday," she said. He followed his daughter toward the door. Avery turned back to the window. The city was still there, still loud, still bright, still indifferent. 41 scholarship recipients were getting into cars and taxis and subway stations across Manhattan. Patricia from Accounts Receivable, whose son was in his second year of college, was somewhere in that city carrying something lighter than she had been carrying 7 months ago. The forensic student was probably already thinking about what came next. The program would run its next cohort in 3 weeks. There were 4 other companies that had made initial contact about licensing the curriculum. Francis Yee was already arguing for a version that could be adapted for nonprofits and public institutions, which was the right argument and would probably take another year to build properly. There was a lot of work. There was still a lot of work. Avery Sterling had spent 10 years believing that what she was building was the company. That the company was the point, the structure and the revenue and the market position and the long game of making something significant enough that it outlasted its own moment. The company was still there. It was hers. She intended to keep it. But she understood, in a way she had not understood before, a rounding error and a Tuesday night and a man who got up from his dinner and walked towards something difficult. She understood that the company was not the point. It was the mechanism. The point was the people inside it and the people affected by it, and the obligation you carried when you were the person at the front of the room To be as honest about what you were looking at as an 8-year-old girl watching 4 strangers surround a woman in a restaurant. To see it clearly. To not look away. And then to do something about what you saw. That was all. That was the whole of it. She stood at the window until the room was empty, and then she picked up her phone and called her sister. "It went well," she said when Dana answered. "Yeah?" Dana's voice had the warmth of someone who had been waiting to hear exactly this. "Yeah." Avery looked at the city. "Come visit soon. I'll actually be here." "You better be," Dana said. Outside, Manhattan moved in every direction at once, carrying its 10,000 ordinary days and its rare, costly, necessary ones all together in the same current, indifferent to the difference between them. But the difference existed. It was real. It mattered, in the specific way that things matter when they have cost something true and produced something that lasts. Some nights leave a mark. Some marks become something you build on. This one had.